I have been living in relative peace, quiet, and isolation for some time now. I don't know what it was, but after the pandemic ended and everyone went back to their normal lives of socializing and being out and traveling and going to concerts and restaurants, I stayed in social distancing mode. It worked for me, to be honest. Even before the pandemic, my entire life was online. All my friends, family, coworkers, and relationships, the way I communicated with them was through my laptop and my phone. You may think it's sad, weird, or not a very fulfilling life, but it was for me. I loved being alone and not interacting with anyone in person. It's not that I had social anxiety. In fact, I was quite extroverted when I wanted to be, but I just preferred it this way. I lived in a ranch-style home I rented for cheap in Inland Empire, California, and the neighborhood I lived in was fairly removed from the more concentrated parts of East LA, and trust me, Inland Empire was already far removed, so I lived pretty remote. The home was a duplex, so there was a whole other living quarter on the other side of mine, but it had been unoccupied since I moved in the winter of 2019. But in the summer of 2023, a tenant finally moved in. The day the new tenant, or should I say tenants, moved in, I happened to be outside washing my car, and I saw them. They only had one suitcase of belongings. No boxes, no furniture, nothing. Just a lone suitcase. It was a middle-aged woman and her seemingly elderly mother, who barely moved a muscle as the middle-aged woman wheeled her across the front yard in her wheelchair. And what else struck me about them was they were wearing very long night dresses and had bushy long hair down to their lower back. Their hair was unkempt and wild, so much so that I couldn't see either of their faces. I did the typical neighborly thing and waved to them and yelled, "Need any help with your move-in?" They didn't reply. They just continued to the front door. I don't know, maybe they just didn't feel like talking. Fair enough. But I admit, I was fervently curious about them. I mean, they were my new proverbial roommates. I pressed my ear to the wall of my home to hear what they were doing, but I heard nothing. Just vague whispers to one another. I heard no TV, no phone conversations, no sounds of cooking or someone taking a shower. It felt a bit creepy on my part, but I realized that night that perhaps I had truly gotten a bit bored with my pseudo-monastic lifestyle and was desperate for a change in the pattern. And these new neighbors unintentionally offered that. Now, one thing about me that is well known by anyone who has ever lived with me is that I am a very loud snorer. I have a deviated septum I have yet to fix, and it causes me to snore like a dragon. That night as I slept and snored, I heard it for the first time. It shocked me out of my sleep. It was my new neighbor. She was smashing her fist on the wall so loud it continued to just shock me out of my sleep over and over again. I knew it was my snoring that was probably keeping them awake. I yelled out, "Sorry about that." I repositioned to sleep on my side and fell back into slumber. But not 5 minutes later, again. I suppose it was still my snoring. I remember thinking in that moment, oh boy, this is gonna be an issue. The last thing I needed was a light sleeping neighbor. I pressed my ear against the wall again to hear, out of curiosity, what exactly was going on the other side, but again, all I heard was vague, rapid whispering. Well, I had a couch in the living room area of my home, so I figured for that night I'd just sleep out there and maybe talk to them in the morning about the snoring. I went to my couch and passed out yet again. And then, literally 2 minutes into my sleep, the knocking was relentless. Now I was a bit irritated. I got it, I snore loud, but I couldn't help that right now. At least not tonight. So what was I supposed to do, not sleep? I shouted out again across the wall, Sorry, I'll buy some breathing strips in the morning. She was knocking furiously. Okay, I said to myself. So I can't talk either. Got it. Great. Suffice it to say, I gave up on sleeping that night and watched a movie on my laptop until the sun rose. That morning, I began making breakfast as I normally did. Water was running and my microwave was heating up the food, and yet again I heard it continued and continued and continued and continued and continued and continued. For fuck's sake, I thought, she was making more noise than I was with her knocking. I shouted, "Hey, I'm just making breakfast." No response. Just more banging. I ate my breakfast in a poor mood and afterwards stormed out of my home and made the 14-foot journey to my neighbor's front door. I rang the doorbell and waited for a response. Nothing. I rang it again. Still nothing. "Hey, hi, I live next door. Can we talk?" Nothing. I knocked on their door a couple of times. Nothing. "Hey, I really think we should talk about this," I shouted, but before I could finish, I heard a raspy, creaky, sibilant voice say, "Stop. Do not knock again." I replied saying, "Right, sorry, but we need to discuss the knocking that you're doing on the wall. I apologize if I'm making too much noise, but obviously, I need to make food and sleep, so..." She didn't respond. I just heard her breathing hard on the other end. "Hey, could you possibly just open your door so we could chat about this?" I then heard her walk away from the door, ignoring me completely. I threw my hands up in the air in frustration. That day I got some nasal strips for my snoring and got back in time to my place for my 2 p.m. Zoom meeting for work. Sure enough, during the meeting, when it was my turn to talk about my current project, I could barely get a word out without the knocking from my neighbor starting up. I couldn't believe it. I was talking softly. I began to think this person was trolling me, harassing me, and doing this on purpose to annoy me. I shouted, "Hey, could you please stop the knocking? I'm in a meeting." All my yelling did was exasperate the knocking, which ramped up. It sounded like she was gonna bust a hole in the damn wall. I apologized to my boss and coworkers and said I would email them what I had to say. The day turned to night, and it seemed everything I did triggered my neighbor to just knock on the wall. I couldn't watch TV at any volume. If I showered, I heard the knocking. If I spoke on the phone, I heard the knocking. If I exercised, I heard the knocking. All the while, she wouldn't confront me or talk to me. All I heard on their end was the vague whispering. After a week and a half, I had had enough. I called the cops to complain and file a civil anti-harassment suit against my neighbor. But all they said that it wasn't going to do much and that they couldn't control her behavior. Filing a noise complaint would also do no good, and it would delve into a he said, she said situation, as she only did the knocking when I did something at a certain volume. So, for all intents and purposes, she could also file an anti-harassment suit against me or a noise complaint. I was floored, especially when I asked the officer, "Well, what should I do?" And he simply said, "Well, move out." Come on, I couldn't do that. That was so unreasonable. I didn't have the time or the money for a move, and all my friends and family were out of state, so I had nowhere to stay indefinitely. I was fucking trapped. I couldn't live like this. I did a 2-week stint at a hotel, but had to come home sometime. I was hemorrhaging money. And when I got home, I was hoping my neighbor would have calmed down a bit. Maybe the gap between me being there and coming back would have made her chill out, but no. Upon my return, it was worse than ever. I swear I couldn't even walk without the banging starting up. I got to my wit's end and screamed, "Shut the fuck up!" when another flurry of banging started, and then one huge hit, and I heard cracking. When I entered my bedroom, which is where the loud bang came from, I was shocked to find my neighbor had busted a hole in my wall. And oh my God, the smell. The smell that came out of that hole and wafted into my side of the apartment was ungodly. I got down on my knees and tried to look through the hole, but then I jumped back in fear when I saw my neighbor's eye looking through it. She just said, "Be quiet." I patched the hole up with stucco, but the smell didn't cease. That was it. I had had enough. She had damaged property now. I emailed my landlord about the issue, seeing what could be done. And my jaw fell to the floor at his reply. He wrote back, "What? I haven't rented out the second half of the duplex to anyone. I have the key. I haven't given it to anyone new. Can you give me a description of these women? If what you're saying is true, they are illegally squatting at my residence." I couldn't believe it. I figured they must have picked the front door lock and entered. But happiness flooded my system too. They would be evicted immediately, and my life could go back to normal. That night, my landlord arrived at the property and I met him in the front yard. He had the keys to the other side of the duplex with him. I asked him if I could join him in entering the residence. I wanted the gratification of them getting the boot, and I also had a gnawing curiosity about what exactly was going on there. My landlord knocked on the front door with anger. "Hello, excuse me, you are not permitted to be living here. Please come outside now. I will call the police if you don't comply," he said. No answer. My landlord wasted no time and simply opened the front door with the keys. I instantly gagged and threw up in my mouth a little bit at the horrid stench. My landlord did too. In fact, he started coughing. To our shock, the home was empty. No furniture, no decor. It was bare. We heard the whispers of my neighbor deeper into the home. But upon our entry into the foyer, the whispers soon crescendoed into an all-out shouting, and I realized she was chanting something, saying something in a strange language, a mantra over and over and over and over again. We followed the chanting and found my neighbor seated on the floor of the living room, surrounded by what I can only describe as occult paraphernalia, candles, statues, totems, all manner of striking objects. Symbols were drawn on the walls and on the floor, and in the center of the room was her mother, the elderly woman she moved in with, only I realize now, her mother was dead. She was rotting, nearly down to the bone. The corpse was encircled by a symbol on the floor drawn in chalk, and at the border of this symbol were various other sigils. My neighbor's head was tilted back as she chanted. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head. Her body stiffened, and she outreached her arms towards her mother's corpse. My landlord and I looked on in horror as the corpse in the middle of the room began to move. It let out an otherworldly yell, and then my neighbor just simply said, "She's coming back. She's coming back. Mama, Mama, it worked. Your spell is working." Truth be told, my landlord had already called the police, and they showed up right in the middle of the final stages of the ritual. They entered and broke my neighbor's concentration, and I watched in disbelief as the reanimated corpse of her mother collapsed back onto the floor. The police then escorted my neighbor out of the house and bagged her mother's corpse. All the while, my landlord and I remained horrified at what we had just seen. I never returned to sleep overnight in my old home. I stayed at a hotel until finally deciding to move out of state to live with my parents for a time while I looked for a new place. I would not hear from my landlord again. Though I reached out to discuss what we had seen, he had never gotten back to me. I think it traumatized him, and he was trying to forget it. The news covered it though. 50-year-old woman found with her mother's rotting corpse while squatting in a duplex. The reports went on to say the mother had been dead for months, which means when I saw them move in, the mother was already dead. It makes sense why she wasn't moving at all now. My neighbor was sent to a psychiatric facility where she remains to this day. She was mentally unhinged from her mother's death, or so the official report went. They never mentioned anything about the ritual, though, or the symbols or the black magic paraphernalia that was found. I couldn't help but look further into it. I recalled the sigils and symbols I saw drawn in the home and researched them. All the time my neighbor was on the other side of me. She was conducting some sort of necromancy to resurrect her dead mother, a ritual that required complete concentration and needed to be done over the course of an entire month. When my landlord and I barged in, she was in the final stages of the ritual. That's why she kept banging on my wall, because I was breaking her concentration. She never slept, barely ate, and took herself to the brink of death conducting this spell. I admit, I delved a bit too deep, and it all began to scare me, so I abandoned my research and decided to move on. I don't sleep much anymore, because even still, after all this time and states away from that place, I can still hear the knocking, the incessant knocking. Hey all, Scott here, the writer and narrator of Something Sinister, and I just wanted to tell you all that if you like my horror stories, I am in the throes of pre-production for my next horror short film. It is called The Withering, a folk horror about a young woman named Rowan Kramer who steps into the role of caregiver for her dementia-stricken grandmother at a secluded forest cottage, only to uncover a shadowy cult's involvement in the mysterious disappearance of her grandmother's nurse. I'm currently doing a Seed and Spark crowdfunding campaign for the film. Click the link in the description to check the page out. We have some sick, spooky, folk horror-esque perks and rewards for backers. So, again, if you like Something Sinister, you'll love The Withering. Thanks so much for listening, and stay tuned for another episode of Something Sinister coming soon.